The First Man in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 8. A Lunar Morning. The harsh emphasis, the pitiless black and white of scenery had altogether disappeared. The glare of the sun had taken upon itself a faint tinge of amber. The shadows upon the cliff of the crater wall were deeply purple. To the eastward, a dark bank of fog still crouched and sheltered from the sunrise, but to the westward the sky was blue and clear. I began to realize the length of my insensibility. We were no longer in a void. An atmosphere had arisen about us. The outline of things had gained in character, had grown acute and varied, save for a shadowed space of white substance here and there, white substance that was no longer air but snow. The Arctic appearance had gone altogether. Everywhere broad, rusty brown spaces of bare and tumbled earth spread to the blaze of the sun. Here and there at the edge of the snowdrifts were transient little pools and eddies of water, the only thing stirring in that expanse of barrenness. The sunlight inundated the upper two blinds of our sphere and turned our climate to high summer, but our feet were still in shadow, and the sphere was lying upon a drift of snow. And scattered here and there upon the slope, and emphasized by little white threads of unthawed snow upon their shady sides, were shapes like sticks, dry, twisted sticks of the same rusty hue as the rock upon which they lay. That caught one's thoughts sharply. Sticks! On a lifeless world? Then, as my eye grew more accustomed to the texture of their substance, I perceived that almost all this surface had a fibrous texture, like the carpet of brown needles one finds beneath the shade of pine trees. "Cavor," I said. "Yes? It may be a dead world now, but once—" Something arrested my attention. I had discovered among these needles a number of little round objects, and it seemed to me that one of these had moved. "Cavor," I whispered. "What?" But I did not answer at once. I stared incredulous. For an instant I could not believe my eyes. I gave an inarticulate cry. I gripped his arm. I pointed. "Look!" I cried, finding my tongue. "There! Yes, and there!" His eyes followed my pointing finger. "Eh?" he said. How can I describe the thing I saw? It is so petty a thing to state, and yet it seems so wonderful, so pregnant with emotion. I have said that amidst the stick-like litter were these rounded bodies, these little oval bodies that might have passed as very small pebbles. And now first one, and then another, had stirred, had rolled over and cracked, and down the crack of each of them showed a minute line of yellowish green, thrusting outward to meet the hot encouragement of the newly risen sun. For a moment that was all, and then there stirred and burst a third. "It is a seed," said Cavor, and then I heard him whisper very softly, "Life!" Life! And immediately it poured upon us that our vast journey had not been made in vain, that we had come to no arid waste of minerals, but to a world that lived and moved. We watched intensely. I remember I kept rubbing the glass before me with my sleeve, jealous of the faintest suspicion of mist. The picture was clear and vivid only in the middle of the field. All about that center the dead fibers and seeds were magnified and distorted by the curvature of the glass. But we could see enough. One after another, all down the sunlit slope, these miraculous little brown bodies burst and gaped apart, like seed pods, like the husk of fruits, open eager mouths that drank in the heat and light pouring in a cascade from the newly risen sun. Every moment more of these seed coats ruptured, and even as they did so the swelling pioneers overflowed their rent distended seed cases and passed into the second stage of growth. With a steady assurance, a swift deliberation, these amazing seeds thrust a rootlet downward to the earth and a queer little bundle-like bud into the air. In a little while the whole slope was dotted with minute plantlets standing at attention in the blaze of the sun. They did not stand for long. The bundle-like buds swelled and strained and opened with a jerk, thrusting out a coronet of little sharp tips, spreading a whorl of tiny, spiky, brownish leaves that lengthened rapidly, lengthened visibly even as we watched. The movement was slower than any animal's, swifter than any plant's I have ever seen before. How can I suggest it to you, the way that growth went on? The leaf tips grew so that they moved onward even while we looked at them. The brown seed case shriveled and was absorbed with an equal rapidity. Have you ever, on a cold day, taken a thermometer into your warm hand and watched the little thread of mercury creep up the tube? These moon plants grew like that. In a few minutes, as it seemed, the buds of the more forward of these plants had lengthened into a stem and were even putting forth a second whorl of leaves, and all the slope that had seemed so recently a lifeless stretch of litter was now dark with the stunted olive-green herbage of bristling spikes that swayed with the vigor of their growing. I turned about, and behold! Along the upper edge of a rock to the eastward, a similar fringe in a scarcely less forward condition swayed and bent, dark against the blinding glare of the sun. And beyond this fringe was the silhouette of a plant mass, branching clumsily like a cactus, and swelling visibly, swelling like a bladder that fills with air. Then to the westward also I discovered that another such distended form was rising over the scrub. But here the light fell upon its sleek sides, and I could see that its color was a vivid orange hue. It rose as one watched it. If one looked away from it for a minute and then back, its outline had changed. It thrust out blunt, congested branches until in a little time it rose a coralline shape of many feet in height. Compared with such a growth, the terrestrial puffball, which will sometimes swell a foot in diameter in a single night, would be a hopeless laggard. But then the puffball grows against the gravitational pull 6 times that of the moon. Beyond, out of gullies and flats that have been hidden from us, but not from the quickening sun, over reefs and banks of shining rock, a bristling beard of spiky and fleshy vegetation was straining into view, hurrying tumultuously to take advantage of the brief day in which it must flower and fruit and seed again and die. It was like a miracle, that growth. So, one must imagine, the trees and plants arose at the creation and covered the desolation of the new-made earth. Imagine it. Imagine that dawn. The resurrection of the frozen air, the stirring and quickening of the soil, and then this silent uprising of vegetation, this unearthly ascent of fleshiness and spikes. Conceive it all lit by a blaze that would make the intensest sunlight of earth seem watery and weak, and still around this stirring jungle, wherever there was shadow, lingered banks of bluish snow. And to have the picture of our impression complete, you must bear in mind that we saw it all through a thick bent glass, distorting it as things are distorted by a lens, acute only in the center of the picture, and very bright there, and towards the edges magnified and unreal. Chapter 9. Prospecting begins. We cease to gaze. We turn to each other, the same thought, the same question in our eyes. For these plants to grow, there must be some air, however attenuated, air that we also should be able to breathe. The manhole? I said. Yes, said Cavor, if it is air we see. In a little while, I said, these plants will be as high as we are. Suppose after all. Is it certain? How do you know that stuff is air? It may be nitrogen. It may be carbonic acid even. That's easy, he said, and set about proving it. He produced a big piece of crumpled paper from the bale, lit it, and thrust it hastily through the manhole valve. I bent forward and peered down through the thick glass for its appearance outside, that little flame on whose evidence depended so much. I saw the paper drop out and lie lightly upon the snow. The pink flame of its burning vanished. For an instant it seemed to be extinguished, and then I saw a little blue tongue upon the edge of it that trembled and crept and spread. Quietly the whole sheet, save where it lay in immediate contact with the snow, charred and shriveled and sent up a quivering thread of smoke. There was no doubt left to me. The atmosphere of the moon was either pure oxygen or air, and capable, therefore, unless its tenuity was excessive, of supporting our alien life. We might emerge and live. I sat down with my legs on either side of the manhole and prepared to unscrew it, but Cavor stopped me. "There is first a little precaution," he said. He pointed out that although it was certainly an oxygenated atmosphere outside, it might still be so rarefied as to cause us grave injury. He reminded me of mountain sickness, and of the bleeding that often afflicts aeronauts who have ascended too swiftly, and he spent some time in the preparation of a sickly-tasting drink which he insisted on my sharing. It made me feel a little numb, but otherwise had no effect on me. Then he permitted me to begin unscrewing. Presently the glass stopper of the manhole was so far undone that the denser air within our sphere began to escape along the thread of the screw, singing as a kettle sings before it boils. Thereupon he made me desist. It speedily became evident that the pressure outside was very much less than it was within. How much less it was we had no means of telling. I sat grasping the stopper with both hands, ready to close it again if, in spite of our intense hope, the lunar atmosphere should after all prove too rarefied for us, and Cavor sat with a cylinder of compressed oxygen at hand to restore our pressure. We looked at one another in silence, and then at the fantastic vegetation that swayed and grew visibly and noiselessly without, and ever that shrill piping continued. My blood vessels began to throb in my ears, and the sound of Cavor's movements diminished. I noted how still everything had become because of the thinning of the air. As our air sizzled out from the screw, the moisture of it condensed in little puffs. Presently I experienced a peculiar shortness of breath that lasted indeed during the whole of the time of our exposure to the moon's exterior atmosphere, and a rather unpleasant sensation about the ears and fingernails and the back of the throat grew upon my attention, and presently passed off again. But then came vertigo and nausea that abruptly changed the quality of my courage. I gave the lid of the manhole half a turn and made a hasty explanation to Cavor, but now he was the more sanguine. He answered me in a voice that seemed extraordinarily small and remote, because of the thinness of the air that carried the sound. He recommended a nip of brandy, and set me the example, and presently I felt better. I turned the manhole stopper back again. The throbbing in my ears grew louder, and then I remarked that the piping note of the outrush had ceased. For a time I could not be sure that it had ceased. "Well?" said Cavor in the ghost of a voice. "Well?" said I. "Shall we go on?" I thought. "Is this all?" "If you can stand it." By way of answer I went on unscrewing. I lifted the circular operculum from its place and laid it carefully on the bale. A flake or so of snow whirled and vanished as that thin and unfamiliar air took possession of our sphere. I knelt and then seated myself at the edge of the manhole, peering over it. Beneath, within a yard of my face, lay the untrodden snow of the moon. There came a little pause. Our eyes met. "It doesn't distress your lungs too much?" said Cavor. "No," I said. "I can stand this." He stretched out his hand for his blanket, thrust his head through its central hole, and wrapped it about him. He sat down on the edge of the manhole. He let his feet drop until they were within 6 inches of the lunar ground. He hesitated for a moment, then thrust himself forward, dropped those intervening inches, and stood upon the untrodden soil of the moon. As he stepped forward he was refracted grotesquely by the edge of the glass. He stood for a moment looking this way and that. Then he drew himself together and leapt, The glass distorted everything, but it seemed to me, even then, to be an extremely big leap. He had at one bound become remote. He seemed 20 or 30 feet off. He was standing high upon a rocky mass and gesticulating back to me. Perhaps he was shouting, but the sound did not reach me. But how the deuce had he done this? I felt like a man who has just seen a new conjuring trick. In a puzzled state of mind, I too dropped through the manhole. I stood up. Just in front of me, the snowdrift had fallen away and made a sort of ditch. I made a step and jumped. I found myself flying through the air, saw the rock on which he stood coming to meet me, clutched it and clung in a state of infinite amazement. I gasped a painful laugh. I was tremendously confused. Cavor bent down and shouted in piping tones for me to be careful. I had forgotten that on the moon, with only an eighth part of the Earth's mass and a quarter of its diameter, my weight was barely a sixth what it was on Earth. But now that fact insisted on being remembered. "We are out of Mother Earth's leading strings now," he said. With a guarded effort, I raised myself to the top, and moving as cautiously as a rheumatic patient, stood up beside him under the blaze of the sun. The sphere lay behind us on its dwindling snowdrift 30 feet away. As far as the eye could see over the enormous disorder of rocks that formed the crater floor, the same bristling scrub that surrounded us was starting into life, diversified here and there by bulging masses of a cactus form, and scarlet and purple lichens that grew so fast they seemed to crawl over the rocks. The whole area of the crater seemed to me then to be one similar wilderness up to the very foot of the surrounding cliff. This cliff was apparently bare of vegetation, save at its base, and with buttresses and terraces and platforms that did not very greatly attract our attention at the time. It was many miles away from us in every direction. We seemed to be almost at the center of the crater, and we saw it through a certain haziness that drove before the wind. For there was even a wind now in the thin air, a swift yet weak wind that chilled exceedingly but exerted little pressure. It was blowing round the crater, as it seemed, to the hot illuminated side from the foggy darkness under the sunward wall. It was difficult to look into this eastward fog. We had to peer with half-closed eyes beneath the shade of our hands because of the fierce intensity of the motionless sun. "It seems to be deserted," said Cavor. "Absolutely desolate." I looked about me again. I retained even then a clinging hope of some quasi-human evidence, some pinnacle of building, some house or engine, but everywhere one looked spread the tumbled rocks and peaks and crests, and the darting scrub and those bulging cacti that swelled and swelled, a flat negation, as it seemed, of all such hope. "It looks as though these plants had it to themselves," I said. "I see no trace of any other creature." "No insects, no birds, no, not a trace, not a scrap nor particle of animal life. If there was, what would they do in the night? No, there's just these plants alone." I shaded my eyes with my hand. "It's like the landscape of a dream. These things are less like earthly land plants than the things one imagines among the rocks at the bottom of the sea. Look at that yonder. One might imagine it is a lizard changed into a plant. And the glare!" "This is only the fresh morning," said Cavor. He sighed and looked about him. "This is no world for men," he said. "And yet, in a way, it appeals." He became silent for a time, then commenced his meditative humming. I started at a gentle touch, and found a thin sheet of livid lichen lapping over my shoe. I kicked at it, and it fell to powder, and each speck began to grow. I heard Cavor exclaim sharply, and perceived that one of the fixed bayonets of the scrub had pricked him. He hesitated, his eyes sought among the rocks about us. A sudden blaze of pink had crept up a ragged pillar of crag. It was most extraordinary pink, a livid magenta. "Look," said I, turning, and behold Cavor had vanished. For an instant I stood transfixed. Then I made a hasty step to look over the verge of the rock. But in my surprise at his disappearance I forgot once more that we were on the moon. The thrust of my foot that I made in striding would have carried me a yard on earth. On the moon it carried me 6, a good 5 yards over the edge. For a moment the thing had something of the effect of those nightmares when one falls and falls. For while one falls 16 feet in the first second of a fall on earth, on the moon one falls 2, and with only a sixth of one's weight. I fell, or rather I jumped down, about 10 yards, I suppose. It seemed to take quite a long time, 5 or 6 seconds, I should think. I floated through the air and fell like a feather, knee-deep in a snowdrift in the bottom of a gully of blue-gray, white-veined rock. I looked about me. "Cavor!" I cried. But no Cavor was visible. "Cavor!" I cried louder, and the rocks echoed me. I turned fiercely to the rocks and clambered to the summit of them. "Cavor!" I cried. My voice sounded like the voice of a lost lamb. The sphere, too, was not in sight, and for a moment a horrible feeling of desolation pinched my heart. Then I saw him. He was laughing and gesticulating to attract my attention. He was on a bare patch of rock 20 or 30 yards away. I could not hear his voice, but "jump" said his gestures. I hesitated. The distance seemed enormous. Yet I reflected that surely I must be able to clear a greater distance than Cavor. I made a step back, gathered myself together, and leaped with all my might. I seemed to shoot right up in the air as though I should never come down. It was horrible and delightful and as wild as a nightmare to go flying off in this fashion. I realized my leap had been altogether too violent. I flew clean over Cavor's head and beheld a spiky confusion in a gully spreading to meet my fall. I gave a yelp of alarm. I put out my hands and straightened my legs. I hit a huge fungoid bulk that burst all about me, scattering a mass of orange spores in every direction and covering me with orange powder. I rolled over spluttering and came to rest convulsed with breathless laughter. I became aware of Cavor's little round face peering over a bristling hedge. He shouted some faded inquiry. "Eh?" I tried to shout, but could not do so for want of breath. He made his way towards me, coming gingerly among the bushes. "We've got to be careful," he said. "This moon has no discipline. She'll let us smash ourselves." He helped me to my feet. "You exerted yourself too much," he said, dabbing at the yellow stuff with his hand to remove it from my garments. I stood passive and panting, allowing him to beat off the jelly from my knees and elbows and lecture me upon my misfortunes. "We don't quite allow for the gravitation. Our muscles are scarcely educated yet. We must practice a little, when you've got your breath." I pulled 2 or 3 little thorns out of my hand and sat for a time on a boulder of rock. My muscles were quivering, and I had that feeling of personal disillusionment that comes at the first fall to the learner of cycling on earth. It suddenly occurred to Cavor that the cold air in the gully, after the brightness of the sun, might give me a fever. So we clambered back into the sunlight. We found that beyond a few abrasions, I had received no serious injuries from my tumble, and at Cavor's suggestion we were presently looking round for some safe and easy landing place for my next leap. We chose a rocky slab some 10 yards off, separated from us by a little thicket of olive-green spikes. "Imagine it there," said Cavor, who was assuming the airs of a trainer, and he pointed to a spot about 4 feet from my toes. This leap I managed without difficulty, and I must confess I found a certain satisfaction in Cavor's falling short by a foot or so, and tasting the spikes of the scrub. "One has to be careful, you see," he said, pulling out his thorns, and with that he ceased to be my mentor and became my fellow learner in the art of lunar locomotion. We chose a still easier jump and did it without difficulty, and then leaped back again, and to and fro several times, accustoming our muscles to the new standard. I could never have believed, had I not experienced it, how rapid that adaptation would be. In a very little time indeed, certainly after fewer than 30 leaps, we could judge the effort necessary for a distance with almost terrestrial assurance. And all this time the lunar plants were growing around us, higher and denser and more entangled. Every moment thicker and taller, spiked plants, green cactus masses, fungi, fleshy and lichenous things, strangest radiate and sinuous shapes. But we were so intent upon our leaping that for a time we gave no heed to their unfaltering expansion. An extraordinary elation had taken possession of us. Partly, I think, it was our sense of release from the confinement of the sphere. Mainly, however, the thin sweetness of the air, which I am certain contained a much larger proportion of oxygen than our terrestrial atmosphere. In spite of the strange quality of all about us, I felt as adventurous and experimental as a cockney would do, placed for the first time among mountains, and I do not think it occurred to either of us, face to face though we were with the unknown, to be very greatly afraid. We were bitten by a spirit of enterprise. We selected a lichenous kopje perhaps 15 yards away, and landed neatly on its summit, one after the other. "Good!" we cried to each other. "Good!" And Cavor made 3 steps and went off an tempting slope of snow a good 20 yards and more beyond. I stood for a moment struck by the grotesque effect of his soaring figure, his dirty cricket cap and spiky hair, his little round body, his arms and his knickerbockered legs tucked up tightly, against the weird spaciousness of the lunar scene. A gust of laughter seized me, and then I stepped off to follow. Plump! I dropped beside him. We made a few gargantuan strides, leaped 3 or 4 times more, and sat down at last in a lichenous hollow. Our lungs were painful. We sat holding our sides and recovering our breath, looking appreciation to one another. Cavor panted something about amazing sensations, and then came a thought into my head. For the moment it did not seem a particularly appalling thought, simply a natural question arising out of the situation. "By the way," I said, "where exactly is the sphere?" Cavor looked at me. "Eh?" The full meaning of what we were saying struck me sharply. "Cavor!" I cried, laying a hand on his arm. "Where is the sphere?" Chapter 10. Lost Men in the Moon. His face caught something of my dismay. He stood up and stared about him at the scrub that fenced us in and rose about us, straining upward in a passion of growth. He put a dubious hand to his lips. He spoke with a sudden lack of assurance. "I think," he said slowly, "we left it somewhere about there." He pointed a hesitating finger that wavered in an arc. "I'm not sure." His look of consternation deepened. "Anyhow," he said, with his eyes on me, "it can't be far." We had both stood up. We made unmeaning ejaculations. Our eyes sought in the twining, thickening jungle round about us. All about us on the sunlit slopes frothed and swayed the darting shrubs, the swelling cactus, the creeping lichens, and wherever the shade remained, the snowdrifts lingered. North, south, east, and west spread an identical monotony of unfamiliar forms, and somewhere, buried already among this tangled confusion, was our sphere, our home, our only provision, our only hope of escape from this fantastic wilderness of ephemeral growths into which we had come. "I think, after all," he said, pointing suddenly, "it might be over there." "No," I said. "We have turned in a curve. See, here is the mark of my heels. It's clear the thing must be more to the eastward, much more. No, the sphere must be over there." "I think," said Cavor,
I kept the sun upon my right all the time. Every leap, it seems to me, I said, my shadow flew before me. We stared into one another's eyes. The area of the crater had become enormously vast to our imaginations, the growing thickets already impenetrably dense. Good heavens, what fools we have been! It's evident that we must find it again, said Cavor, and that soon. The sun grows stronger. We should be fainting with the heat already if it wasn't so dry, and I'm hungry. I stared at him. I had not suspected this aspect of the matter before, but it came to me at once, a positive craving. Yes, I said with emphasis, I am hungry too. He stood up with a look of active resolution. Certainly, we must find the sphere. As calmly as possible, we surveyed the interminable reefs and thickets that formed the floor of the crater, each of us weighing in silence the chances of our finding the sphere before we were overtaken by heat and hunger. It can't be 50 yards from here, said Cavor with indecisive gestures. The only thing is to beat round about until we come upon it. That is all we can do, I said without any alacrity to begin our hunt. I wish this confounded spike bush did not grow so fast. That's just it, said Cavor. But it was lying on a bank of snow. I stared about me in the vain hope of recognizing some knoll or shrub that had been near the sphere, but everywhere was a confusing sameness, everywhere the aspiring bushes, the distending fungi, the dwindling snowbanks, steadily and inevitably changed. The sun scorched and stung. The faintness of an unaccountable hunger mingled with our infinite perplexity. And even as we stood there, confused and lost amidst unprecedented things, we became aware for the first time of a sound upon the moon other than the air of the growing plants, the faint sighing of the wind, or those that we ourselves had made. Boom, boom, boom. It came from beneath our feet, a sound in the earth. We seemed to hear it with our feet as much as with our ears. Its dull resonance was muffled by distance, thick with the quality of intervening substance. No sound that I can imagine could have astonished us more, or have changed more completely the quality of things about us. For this sound, rich, slow, and deliberate, seemed to us as though it could be nothing but the striking of some gigantic buried clock. Boom, boom, boom. Sound suggestive of still cloisters, of sleepless nights in crowded cities, of vigils and the awaited hour, of all that is orderly and methodical in life, booming out pregnant and mysterious in this fantastic desert. To the eye everything was unchanged, the desolation of bushes and cacti waving silently in the wind, stretched unbroken to the distant cliffs. The still dark sky was empty overhead, and the hot sun hung and burned. And through it all, a warning, a threat, throbbed this enigma of sound. Boom, boom, boom. We questioned one another in faint and faded voices. A clock? Like a clock? What is it? What can it be? Count, was Cavor's belated suggestion, and at that word the striking ceased. The silence, the rhythmic disappointment of the silence, came as a fresh shock. For a moment one could doubt whether one had ever heard a sound, or whether it might still not be going on. Had I indeed heard a sound? I felt the pressure of Cavor's hand upon my arm. He spoke in an undertone, as though he feared to wake some sleeping thing. "Let us keep together," he whispered, "and look for the sphere. We must get back to the sphere. This is beyond our understanding." "Which way shall we go?" He hesitated. An intense persuasion of presences, of unseen things about us and near us, dominated our minds. What could they be? Where could they be? Was this arid desolation, alternately frozen and scorched, only the outer rind and mask of some subterranean world? And if so, what sort of world? What sort of inhabitants might it not presently disgorge upon us? And then, stabbing the aching stillness as vivid and sudden as an unexpected thunderclap, came a clang and rattle as though great gates of metal had suddenly been flung apart. It arrested our steps. We stood gaping helplessly. Then Cavor stole towards me. "I do not understand," he whispered close to my face. He waved his hand vaguely skyward, the vague suggestion of still vaguer thoughts. "A hiding place, if anything came." I looked about us. I nodded my head in assent to him. We started off, moving stealthily with the most exaggerated precautions against noise. We went towards a thicket of scrub. A clangor like hammers flung about a boiler hastened our steps. "We must crawl," whispered Cavor. The lower leaves of the bayonet plants, already overshadowed by the newer ones above, were beginning to wilt and shrivel so that we could thrust our way in among the thickening stems without serious injury. A stab in the face or arm we did not heed. At the heart of the thicket I stopped and stared panting into Cavor's face. "Subterranean," he whispered. "Below. They may come out. We must find the sphere." "Yes," I said. "But how?" "Crawl till we come to it." "But if we don't?" "Keep hidden. See what they are like." "We will keep together," said I. He thought. "Which way shall we go?" "We must take our chance." We peered this way and that. Then very circumspectly, we began to crawl through the lower jungle, making, so far as we could judge, a circuit, halting now at every waving fungus, at every sound, intent only on the sphere from which we had so foolishly emerged. Ever and again from out of the earth beneath us came concussions, beatings, strange, inexplicable mechanical sounds, and once, and then again, we thought we heard something, a faint rattle and tumult, borne to us through the air. But fearful as we were, we dared essay no vantage point to survey the crater. For long we saw nothing of the beings whose sounds were so abundant and insistent. But for the faintness of our hunger and the drying of our throats, that crawling would have been the only quality of a very vivid dream. It was so absolutely unreal. The only element with any touch of reality was those sounds. Picture it to yourself. About us the dreamlike jungle, with the silent bayonet leaves darting overhead, and the silent, vivid, sun-splashed lichens under our hands and knees, waving with the vigor of their growth as a carpet waves when the wind gets beneath it. Ever and again one of the bladder fungi, bulging and distending under the sun, loomed upon us. Ever and again some novel shape and vivid color obtruded. The very cells that built up these plants were as large as my thumb, like beads of colored glass. And all these things were saturated in the unmitigated glare of the sun, were seen against a sky that was bluish black and spangled still, in spite of the sunlight, with a few surviving stars. Strange. The very forms and textures of the stones were strange. It was all strange. The feeling of one's body was unprecedented. Every other movement ended in a surprise. The breath sucked thin in one's throat. The blood flowed through one's ears in a throbbing tide. Thud, 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 thud. And ever and again came gusts of turmoil, hammering, the clanging and throb of machinery, and presently the bellowing of great beasts. Chapter 11. The Mooncalf Pastures. So we two poor terrestrial castaways, lost in that wild-growing moon jungle, crawled in terror before the sounds that had come upon us.
We crawled, as it seemed, a long time before we saw either selenite or mooncalf, though we heard the bellowing and gruntulous noises of these latter continually drawing nearer to us. We crawled through stony ravines, over snow slopes, amidst fungi that ripped like thin bladders at our thrust, emitting a watery humor, over a perfect pavement of things like puffballs, and beneath interminable thickets of scrub. And ever more helplessly our eyes sought for our abandoned sphere. The noise of the mooncalves would at times be a vast, flat, calf-like sound. At times it rose to an amazed and wrathy bellowing, and again it would become a clogged, bestial sound, as though these unseen creatures had sought to eat and bellow at the same time. Our first view was but an inadequate transitory glimpse, yet none the less disturbing because it was incomplete. Cavor was crawling in front at the time, and he first was aware of their proximity. He stopped dead, arresting me with a single gesture. A crackling and smashing of the scrub appeared to be advancing directly upon us, and then, as we squatted close and endeavored to judge of the nearness and direction of this noise, there came a terrific bellow behind us, so close and vehement that the tops of the bayonet scrub bent before it, and one felt the breath of it hot and moist. And, turning about, we saw indistinctly through a crowd of swaying stems the mooncalf's shining sides, and the long line of its back loomed out against the sky. Of course, it is hard for me now to say how much I saw at that time, because my impressions were corrected by subsequent observation. First of all impressions was its enormous size. The girth of its body was some 80 feet, its length perhaps 200. Its sides rose and fell with its labored breathing. I perceived that its gigantic flabby body lay along the ground, and that its skin was of a corrugated white, dappling into blackness along the backbone. But of its feet we saw nothing. I think also that we saw then the profile, at least of the almost brainless head, with its fat encumbered neck, its slobbering omnivorous mouth, its little nostrils, and tight-shut eyes. For the mooncalf invariably shuts its eyes in the presence of the sun. We had a glimpse of a vast red pit as it opened its mouth to bleat and bellow again. We had a breath from the pit, and then the monster heeled over like a ship, dragged forward along the ground, creasing all its leathery skin, rolled again, and so wallowed past us, smashing a path amidst the scrub, and was speedily hidden from our eyes by the dense interlacings beyond. Another appeared more distantly, and then another, and then, as though he was guiding these animated lumps of provender to their pasture, a selenite came momentarily into ken. My grip upon Cavor's foot became convulsive at the sight of him, and we remained motionless and peering long after he had passed out of our range. By contrast with the mooncalves, he seemed a trivial being, a mere ant, scarcely 5 feet high. He was wearing garments of some leathery substance, so that no portion of his actual body appeared. But of this, of course, we were entirely ignorant. He presented himself, therefore, as a compact, bristling creature, having much of the quality of a complicated insect, with whip-like tentacles and a clanging arm projecting from his shining cylindrical body case. The form of his head was hidden by his enormous, many-spiked helmet. We discovered afterwards that he used the spikes for prodding refractory mooncalves. And a pair of goggles of darkened glass, set very much at the side, gave a bird-like quality to the metallic apparatus that covered his face. His arms did not project beyond his body case, and he carried himself upon short legs that, wrapped though they were in warm coverings, seemed to our terrestrial eyes inordinately flimsy. They had very short thighs, very long shanks, and little feet. In spite of his heavy-looking clothing, he was progressing with what would be, from the terrestrial point of view, very considerable strides, and his clanging arm was busy. The quality of his motion during the instant of his passing suggested haste and a certain anger,
and soon after we had lost sight of him, we heard the bellow of a mooncalf change abruptly into a short, sharp squeal, followed by the scuffle of its acceleration. And gradually that bellowing receded, and then came to an end, as if the pastures sought had been attained. We listened. For a space the moon world was still, but it was some time before we resumed our crawling search for the vanished sphere. When next we saw mooncalves, they were some little distance away from us in a place of tumbled rocks. The less vertical surfaces of the rocks were thick with a speckled green plant, growing in dense mossy clumps, upon which these creatures were browsing. We stopped at the edge of the reeds amidst which we were crawling at the sight of them, peering out at them and looking round for a second glimpse of a selenite. They lay against their food like stupendous slugs, huge, greasy hulls, eating greedily and noisily, with a sort of sobbing avidity. They seemed monsters of mere fatness, clumsy and overwhelmed to a degree that would make a Smithfield ox seem a model of agility. Their busy, writhing, chewing mouths and eyes closed, together with the appetizing sound of their munching, made up an effect of animal enjoyment that was singularly stimulating to our empty frames. "Hogs," said Cavor with unusual passion. "Disgusting hogs!" And after one glare of angry envy, crawled off through the bushes to our right. I stayed long enough to see that the speckled plant was quite hopeless for human nourishment, then crawled after him, nibbling a quill of it between my teeth. Presently we were arrested again by the proximity of a selenite, and this time we were able to observe him more exactly. Now we could see that the selenite covering was indeed clothing, and not a sort of crustacean integument. He is quite similar in his costume to the former one we had glimpsed, except that ends of something like wadding were protruding from his neck, and he stood on a promontory of rock and moved his head this way and that, as though he was surveying the crater. We lay quite still, fearing to attract his attention if we moved, and after a time he turned about and disappeared. We came upon another drove of mooncalves bellowing up a ravine, and then we passed over a place of sounds of beating machinery, as if some huge hall of industry came near the surface there. And while these sounds were still about us, we came to the edge of a great open space, perhaps 200 yards in diameter and perfectly level. Save for a few lichens that advanced from its margin, this space was bare, and presented a powdery surface of a dusty yellow color. We were afraid to strike out across this space, but as it presented less obstruction to our crawling than the scrub, we went down upon it and began very circumspectly to skirt its edge. For a little while the noises from below ceased, and everything, save for the faint stir of the growing vegetation, was very still. Then abruptly there began an uproar, louder, more vehement, and nearer than any we had so far heard. Of a certainty it came from below. Instinctively we crouched as flat as we could, ready for a prompt plunge into the thicket beside us. Each knock and throb seemed to vibrate through our bodies. Louder grew this throbbing and beating, and that irregular vibration increased until the whole moon world seemed to be jerking and pulsing. "Cover," whispered Cavor, and I turned towards the bushes. At that instant came a thud like the thud of a gun, and then a thing happened. It still haunts me in my dreams. I had turned my head to look at Cavor's face, and thrust out my hand in front of me as I did so. And my hand met nothing. I plunged suddenly into a bottomless hole. My chest hit something hard, and I found myself with my chin on the edge of an unfathomable abyss that had suddenly opened beneath me, my hand extended stiffly into the void. The whole of that flat circular area was no more than a gigantic lid that was now sliding sideways from off the pit it had covered into a slot prepared for it. Had it not been for Cavor, I think I should have remained rigid, hanging over this margin and staring into the enormous gulf below, until at last the edges of the slot scraped me off and hurled me into its depths. But Cavor had not received the shock that had paralyzed me. He had been a little distance from the edge when the lid had first opened, and perceiving the peril that held me helpless, gripped my legs and pulled me backwards. I came into a sitting position, crawled away from the edge for a space on all fours, then staggered up and ran after him across the thundering, quivering sheet of metal. It seemed to be swinging open with a steadily accelerated velocity, and the bushes in front of me shifted sideways as I ran. I was none too soon. Cavor's back vanished amidst the bristling thicket, and as I scrambled up after him, the monstrous valve came into its position with a clang. For a long time we lay panting, not daring to approach the pit. But at last, very cautiously, and bit by bit, we crept into a position from which we could peer down. The bushes about us creaked and swayed with the force of a breeze that was blowing down the shaft. We could see nothing at first except smooth vertical walls descending at last into an impenetrable black. And then, very gradually, we became aware of a number of very faint and little lights going to and fro. For a time that stupendous gulf of mystery held us so that we forgot even our sphere. In time, as we grew more accustomed to the darkness, we could make out very small, dim, elusive shapes moving about among those needlepoint illuminations. We peered amazed and incredulous, understanding so little that we could find no words to say. We could distinguish nothing that would give us a clue to the meaning of the faint shapes we saw. "What can it be?" I asked. "What can it be?" "The engineering. They must live in these caverns during the night and come out during the day." "Cavor," I said, "can they be that it was something like men?" "That was not a man." "We dare risk nothing." "We dare do nothing until we find the sphere." "We can do nothing until we find the sphere." He assented with a groan, and stirred himself to move. He stared about him for a space, sighed, and indicated a direction. We struck out through the jungle. For a time we crawled resolutely, then with diminishing vigor. Presently among great shapes of flabby purple there came a noise of trampling and cries about us. We lay close, and for a long time the sounds went to and fro, and very near. But this time we saw nothing. I tried to whisper to Cavor that I could hardly go without food much longer, but my mouth had become too dry for whispering. "Cavor," I said, "I must have food." He turned a face full of dismay towards me. "It's a case for holding out," he said. "But I must," I said, "and look at my lips. I've been thirsty some time. If only some of that snow had remained. It's clean gone. We're driving from Arctic to tropical at the rate of a degree a minute." I gnawed my hand. "The sphere," he said. "There's nothing for it but the sphere." We roused ourselves to another spurt of crawling. My mind ran entirely on edible things, on the hissing profundity of summer drinks. More particularly, I craved for beer. I was haunted by the memory of a 16-gallon cask that had swaggered in my Lympne cellar. I thought of the adjacent larder, and especially of steak and kidney pie. Tender steak and plenty of kidney, and rich, thick gravy between. Ever and again I was seized with fits of hungry yawning. We came to flat places overgrown with fleshy red things, monstrous coralline growths. As we pushed against them they snapped and broke. I noted the quality of the broken surfaces. The confounded stuff certainly looked of a biteable texture. Then it seemed to me that it smelt rather well. I picked up a fragment and sniffed at it. "Cavor," I said in a hoarse undertone. He glanced at me with his face screwed up. "Don't," he said. I put down the fragment, and we crawled on through this tempting fleshiness for a space. "Cavor?" I asked. "Why not?" "Poison," I heard him say, but he did not look round. We crawled some way before I decided. "I'll chance it," said I. He made a belated gesture to prevent me. I stuffed my mouth full. He crouched watching my face, his own twisted into the oddest expression. "It's good," I said. "Oh, Lord!" he cried. He watched me munch, his face wrinkled between desire and disapproval, then suddenly succumbed to appetite and began to tear off huge mouthfuls. For a time we did nothing but eat. The stuff was not unlike a terrestrial mushroom, only it was much laxer in texture, and as one swallowed it, it warmed the throat. At first we experienced a mere mechanical satisfaction in eating. Then our blood began to run warmer, and we tingled at the lips and fingers, and then new and slightly irrelevant ideas came bubbling up in our minds. "It's good," said I. "Infernally good. What a home for our surplus population. Our poor surplus population." And I broke off another large portion. It filled me with a curiously benevolent satisfaction that there was such good food in the moon. The depression of my hunger gave way to an irrational exhilaration. The dread and discomfort in which I had been living vanished entirely. I perceived the moon no longer as a planet from which I most earnestly desired the means of escape, but as a possible refuge from human destitution. I think I forgot the Selenites, the mooncalves, the lid, and the noises completely so soon as I had eaten that fungus. Cavor replied to my third repetition of my surplus population remark with similar words of approval. I felt that my head swam, but I put this down to the stimulating effect of food after a long fast. "Excellent discovery, yours, Cavor," said I. "Second only to the Theta." "What d'yer mean?" asked Cavor. "Discovery of the moon, second only to the Theta." I looked at him, shocked at his suddenly hoarse voice and by the badness of his articulation. It occurred to me in a flash that he was intoxicated, possibly by the fungus. It also occurred to me that he erred in imagining that he had discovered the moon. He had not discovered it, he had only reached it. I tried to lay my hand on his arm and explain this to him, but the issue was too subtle for his brain. It was also unexpectedly difficult to express. After a momentary attempt to understand me, I remember wondering if the fungus had made my eyes as fishy as his. He set off upon some observations on his own account. "We are," he announced with a solemn hiccup, "the creatures of what we eat and drink." He repeated this, and as I was now in one of my subtle moods, I determined to dispute it. Possibly I wandered a little from the point, but Cavor certainly did not attend at all properly. He stood up as well as he could, putting a hand on my head to steady himself, which was disrespectful, and stood staring about him, quite devoid now of any fear of the moon beings. I tried to point out that this was dangerous for some reason that was not perfectly clear to me, but the word dangerous had somehow got mixed with indiscreet, and came out rather more like injurious than either, and after an attempt to disentangle them, I resumed my argument, addressing myself principally to the unfamiliar but attentive coralline growths on either side. I felt that it was necessary to clear up this confusion between the moon and a potato at once. I wandered into a long parenthesis on the importance of precision of definition in argument. I did my best to ignore the fact that my bodily sensations were no longer agreeable. In some way that I have now forgotten, my mind was led back to projects of colonization. "We must annex this moon," I said. "There must be no shilly-shally. This is part of the white man's burthen. Cavor, we are satraps. N'Empire Caesar never dreamt. Been all the newspapers. Cavoritia, Bedforditia, limited. Mean unlimited, practically." Certainly I was intoxicated.
I embarked upon an argument to show the infinite benefits our arrival would confer on the moon. I involved myself in a rather difficult proof that the arrival of Columbus was, on the whole, beneficial to America. I found I had forgotten the line of argument I had intended to pursue, and continued to repeat, "similar to Columbus," to fill up time. From that point, my memory of the action of that abominable fungus becomes confused. I remember vaguely that we declared our intention of standing no nonsense from any confounded insects, that we decided it ill became men to hide shamefully upon a mere satellite, that we equipped ourselves with huge armfuls of the fungus, whether for missile purposes or not I do not know, and heedless of the stabs of the bayonet scrub we started forth into the sunshine. Almost immediately we must have come upon the Selenites. There were 6 of them, and they were marching in single file over a rocky place, making the most remarkable piping and whining sounds. They all seemed to become aware of us at once. All instantly became silent and motionless, like animals, with their faces turned toward us. For a moment I was sobered. "Insects," murmured Cavor. "Insects. And they think I'm going to crawl about on my stomach, on my vertebrated stomach." "Stomach," he repeated slowly, as though he chewed the indignity. Then suddenly, with a sort of fury, he made 3 vast strides and leaped towards them. He leaped badly. He made a series of somersaults in the air, whirled right over them, and vanished with an enormous splash amidst the cactus splatters. What the Selenites made of this amazing, and to my mind undignified eruption from another planet, I have no means of guessing. I seem to remember the sight of their backs as they ran in all directions, but I am not sure. All these last incidents before oblivion came are vague and faint in my mind. I know I made a step to follow Cavor, and tripped and fell headlong among the rocks. I was, I am certain, suddenly and vehemently ill. I seem to remember a violent struggle and being gripped by metallic clasps. My next clear recollection is that we were prisoners at we knew not what depths beneath the moon's surface. We were in darkness, amidst strange, distracting noises. Our bodies were covered with scratches and bruises, and our heads racked with pain. Chapter 12. The Selenite's Face. I found myself sitting crouched together in a tumultuous darkness. For a long time I could not understand where I was, nor how I had come to this perplexity. I thought of the cupboard into which I had been thrust at times when I was a child, and then of a very dark and noisy bedroom in which I had slept during an illness. But these sounds about me were not the noises I had known, and there was a thin flavor in the air like the wind of a stable. Then I supposed we must still be at work upon the sphere, and that somehow I had got into the cellar of Cavor's house. I remembered we had finished the sphere, and fancied I must still be in it and traveling through space. "Cavor," I said, "cannot we have some light?" There came no answer. "Cavor," I insisted. I was answered by a groan. "My head," I heard him say. "My head." I attempted to press my hands to my brow, which ached, and discovered they were tied together. This startled me very much. I brought them up to my mouth and felt the cold smoothness of metal. They were chained together. I tried to separate my legs and made out that they were similarly fastened, and also that I was fastened to the ground by a much thicker chain about the middle of my body. I was more frightened than I had yet been by anything in all our strange experiences. For a time I tugged silently at my bonds. "Cavor!" I cried out sharply. "Why am I tied? Why have you tied me hand and foot?" "I haven't tied you," he answered. "It's the Selenites." The Selenites! My mind hung on that for a space. Then my memories came back to me. The snowy desolation, the thawing of the air, the growth of the plants, our strange hopping and crawling among the rocks and vegetation of the crater, All the distress of our frantic search for the sphere returned to me. Finally, the opening of the great lid that covered the pit. Then, as I strained to trace our later movements down to our present plight, the pain in my head became intolerable. I came to an insurmountable barrier, an obstinate blank. "Cavor!"
"Yes."
"Where are we?"
"How should I know?"
"Are we dead?"
"What nonsense!"
"They've got us, then." He made no answer but a grunt. The lingering traces of the poison seemed to make him oddly irritable. "What do you mean to do?"
"How should I know what to do?"
"Oh, very well," said I, and became silent. Presently I was roused from a stupor. "Oh, Lord!" I cried. "I wish you'd stop that buzzing." We lapsed into silence again, listening to the dull confusion of noises like the muffled sounds of a street or factory that filled our ears. I could make nothing of it. My mind pursued first one rhythm and then another, and questioned it in vain. But after a long time I became aware of a new and sharper element, not mingling with the rest but standing out, as it were, against that cloudy background of sound. It was a series of relatively very little definite sounds, tappings and rubbings, like a loose spray of ivy against a window, or a bird moving about upon a box. We listened and peered about us, but the darkness was a velvet pall. There followed a noise like the subtle movement of the wards of a well-oiled lock. And then there appeared before me, hanging as it seemed in an immensity of black, a thin bright line.
"Look,"
whispered Cavor very softly.
"What is it?"
"I don't know." We stared. The thin, bright line became a band, and broader and paler. It took upon itself the quality of a bluish light falling upon a whitewashed wall. It ceased to be parallel-sided. It developed a deep indentation on one side. I turned to remark this to Cavor, and was amazed to see his ear in a brilliant illumination, all the rest of him in shadow. I twisted my head round as well as my bonds would permit. "Cavor," I said, "it's behind." His ear vanished, gave place to an eye. Suddenly the crack that had been emitting the light broadened out, and revealed itself as the space of an opening door. Beyond was a sapphire vista, and in the doorway stood a grotesque outline silhouetted against the glare. We both made convulsive efforts to turn, and failing, sat staring over our shoulders at this. My first impression was of some clumsy quadruped with lowered head. Then I perceived it was the slender, pinched body and short and extremely attenuated bandied legs of a Selenite, with his head depressed between his shoulders. He was without the helmet and body covering they wear upon the exterior. He was a blank, black figure to us, but instinctively our imaginations supplied features to his very human outline. I, at least, took it instantly that he was somewhat hunchbacked, with a high forehead and long features. He came forward 3 steps, and paused for a time. His movement seemed absolutely noiseless. Then he came forward again. He walked like a bird. His feet fell one in front of the other. He stepped out of the ray of light that came through the doorway, and it seemed as though he vanished altogether in the shadow. For a moment my eyes sought him in the wrong place, and then I perceived him standing facing us both in the full light. Only the human features I had attributed to him were not there at all. Of course I ought to have expected that, only I didn't. It came to me as an absolute, for a moment an overwhelming shock. It seemed as though it wasn't a face, as though it must needs be a mask, a horror, a deformity, that would presently be disavowed or explained. There was no nose, and the thing had dull, bulging eyes at the side. In the silhouette I had supposed they were ears. There were no ears. I have tried to draw one of these heads, but I cannot. There was a mouth, downwardly curved like a human mouth, and a face that stares ferociously. The neck on which the head was poised was jointed in 3 places, almost like the short joints in the leg of a crab. The joints of the limbs I could not see, because of the puttee-like straps in which they were swathed, and which formed the only clothing the being wore. There the thing was, looking at us. At the time my mind was taken up by the mad impossibility of the creature. I suppose he also was amazed, and with more reason, perhaps, for amazement than we. Only, confound him, he did not show it. He did at least know what had brought about this meeting of incompatible creatures. But conceive how it would seem to decent Londoners, for example, to come upon a couple of living things as big as men and absolutely unlike any other earthly animals, careering about among the sheep in Hyde Park. It must have taken him like that. Figure us. We were bound hand and foot, fagged and filthy, our beards 2 inches long, our faces scratched and bloody. Cavor you must imagine in his knickerbockers, torn in several places by the bayonet scrub, his Jaeger's shirt and old cricket cap, his wiry hair wildly disordered, a tail to every quarter of the heavens. In that blue light his face did not look red but very dark. His lips and the drying blood upon my hands seemed black. If possible, I was in a worse plight than he, on account of the yellow fungus into which I had jumped. Our jackets were unbuttoned, and our shoes had been taken off and lay at our feet. And we were sitting with our backs to this queer, bluish light, peering at such a monster as Dürer might have invented. Cavor broke the silence, started to speak, went hoarse, and cleared his throat. Outside began a terrific bellowing, as if a mooncalf were in trouble. It ended in a shriek, and everything was still again. Presently the Selenite turned about, flickered into the shadow, stood for a moment retrospective at the door, and then closed it on us, and once more we were in that murmurous mystery of darkness into which we had awakened. Chapter 13. Mr. Cavor makes some suggestions. For a time neither of us spoke. To focus together all the things we had brought upon ourselves seemed beyond my mental powers. "They've got us," I said at last. "It was that fungus." "Well, if I hadn't eaten it we should have fainted and starved." "We might have found the sphere." I lost my temper at his persistence and swore to myself. For a time we hated one another in silence. I drummed with my fingers on the floor between my knees and gritted the links of my fetters together. Presently I was forced to talk again. "What do you make of it, anyhow?" I asked humbly. "They were reasonable creatures. They can make things and do things. Those lights we saw—" He stopped. It was clear he could make nothing of it. When he spoke again it was to confess, "After all, they are more human than we had a right to expect. I suppose—" He stopped irritatingly. "Yes?" "I suppose, anyhow, on any planet where there is an intelligent animal, it will carry its brain case upward and have hands and walk erect." Presently he broke away in another direction. "We are some way in," he said. "I mean, perhaps a couple of 1,000 feet or more." "Why?" "It's cooler, and our voices are so much louder. That faded quality, it is altogether gone, and the feeling in one's ears and throat." I had not noted that, but I did now. "We must be some depths. A mile even we may be, inside the moon." "We never thought of a world inside the moon." "No. How could we?" "We might have done, only one gets into habits of mind." He thought for a time. "Now," he said, "it seems such an obvious thing. Of course, the moon must be enormously cavernous, with an atmosphere within, and at the center of its caverns a sea." One knew that the moon had a lower specific gravity than the earth. One knew that it had little air or water outside. One knew, too, that it was sister planet to the earth, and that it was unaccountable that it should be different in composition. The inference that it was hollowed out was as clear as day, and yet one never saw it as a fact. Kepler, of course. His voice had the interest now of a man who has discerned a pretty sequence of reasoning. Yes, he said. Kepler with his subvulvani was right after all. I wish you had taken the trouble to find that out before we came, I said. He answered nothing, buzzing to himself softly as he pursued his thoughts. My temper was going. What do you think has become of the sphere, anyhow? I asked. Lost, he said, like a man who answers an uninteresting question. Among those plants? Unless they find it. And then? How can I tell? Cavor, I said with a sort of hysterical bitterness. Things look bright for my company. He made no answer. Good Lord, I exclaimed. Just think of all the trouble we took to get into this pickle. What did we come for? What are we after? What was the moon to us, or we to the moon? We wanted too much. We tried too much. We ought to have started the little things first. It was you proposed the moon, those Cavorite spring blinds. I am certain we could have worked them for terrestrial purposes. Certain. Did you really understand what I proposed? A steel cylinder. Rubbish, said Cavor. We ceased to converse. For a time, Cavor kept up a broken monologue without much help from me. If they find it, he began. If they find it, what will they do with it? Well, that's a question. It may be that's the question. They won't understand it anyhow. If they understood that sort of thing, they would have come long since to the earth. Would they? Why shouldn't they? But they would have sent something. They couldn't keep their hands off such a possibility. No, but they will examine it. Clearly they are intelligent and inquisitive. They will examine it, get inside it, trifle with the studs. Off. That would mean the moon for us for all the rest of our lives. Strange creatures, strange knowledge. As for strange knowledge, said I, and language failed me. Look here, Bedford, said Cavor. You came on this expedition of your own free will. You said to me, call it prospecting. There's always risk in prospecting. Especially when you do it unarmed and without thinking out every possibility. I was so taken up with the sphere. The thing rushed on us and carried us away. Rushed on me, you mean? Rushed on me just as much. How was I to know when I set to work on molecular physics that the business would bring me here? Of all places. It's this accursed science, I cried. It's the very devil. The medieval priests and persecutors were right, and the moderns are all wrong. You tamper with it, and it offers you gifts, and directly you take them it knocks you to pieces in some unexpected way. Old passions and new weapons. Now it upsets your religion. Now it upsets your social ideas. Now it whirls you off to desolation and misery. Anyhow, it's no use your quarreling with me now. These creatures, these Selenites, or whatever we choose to call them, have got us tied hand and foot. Whatever temper you choose to go through with it in, you will have to go through with it. We have experiences before us that will need all our coolness. He paused as if he required my assent, but I sat sulking. Confound your science, I said. The problem is communication. Gestures, I fear, will be different. Pointing, for example. No creatures but men and monkeys point. That was too obviously wrong for me. Pretty nearly every animal, I cried, points with its eyes or nose. Cavor meditated over that. Yes, he said at last, and we don't. There's such differences, such differences. One might, but how can I tell? There is speech, the sounds they make, a sort of fluting and piping. I don't see how we are to imitate that. Is it their speech, that sort of thing? They may have different senses, different means of communication. Of course they are minds, and we are minds. There must be something in common. Who knows how far we may not get to an understanding? The things are outside us, I said. They're more different from us than the strangest animals on earth. They are a different clay. What is the good of talking like this? Cavor thought. I don't see that. Where there are minds, they will have something similar, even though they have been evolved on different planets. Of course, if it was a question of instincts, if we or they are no more than animals... Well, are they? They're much more like ants on their hind legs than human beings, and who ever got to any sort of understanding with ants? But these machines and clothing... No, I don't hold with you, Bedford. The difference is wide. It's insurmountable. The resemblance must bridge it. I remember reading once a paper by the late Professor Galton on the possibility of communication between the planets. Unhappily, at that time it did not seem probable that that would be of any material benefit to me, and I fear I did not give it the attention I should have done, in view of this state of affairs. Yet, now, let me see. His idea was to begin with those broad truths that must underlie all conceivable mental existences, and establish a basis on those. The great principles of geometry, to begin with. He proposed to take some leading proposition of Euclid's, and show by construction that its truth was known to us, to demonstrate, for example, that the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal, and that if the equal sides be produced, the angles on the other side of the base are equal also. Or that the square on the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the two other sides. By demonstrating our knowledge of these things, we should demonstrate our possession of a reasonable intelligence. Now, suppose I might draw the geometrical figure with a wet finger, or even trace it in the air. We fell silent. I sat meditating his words. For a time his wild hope of communication, of interpretation, with these weird beings held me. Then that angry despair that was a part of my exhaustion and physical misery resumed its sway. I perceived with a sudden, novel vividness the extraordinary folly of everything I had ever done. Ass, I said. Oh, ass, unutterable ass. I seemed to exist only to go about doing preposterous things. Why did we ever leave the thing? Hopping about looking for patents and concessions in the craters of the moon. If only we had had the sense to fasten a handkerchief to a stick to show where we had left the sphere. I subsided, fuming. It is clear, meditated Cavor, they are intelligent. One can hypothecate certain things. As they have not killed us at once, they must have ideas of mercy. Mercy, at any rate of restraint, possibly of intercourse. They may meet us, and this apartment and the glimpses we had of its guardian. These fetters, a high degree of intelligence. I wish to heaven, cried I, I'd thought even twice. Plunge after plunge, first one fluky start and then another. It was my confidence in you. Why didn't I stick to my play? That was what I was equal to. That was my world and the life I was made for. I could have finished that play. I'm certain it was a good play. I had the scenario as good as done. Then, conceive it, leaping to the moon. Practically, I've thrown my life away. That old woman in the inn near Canterbury had better sense." I looked up and stopped in mid-sentence. The darkness had given place to that bluish light again. The door was opening, and several noiseless Selenites were coming into the chamber. I became quite still, staring at their grotesque faces. Then suddenly my sense of disagreeable strangeness changed to interest. I perceived that the foremost and second carried bowls. One elemental need at least our minds could understand in common. They were bowls of some metal that, like our fetters, looked dark in that bluish light, and each contained a number of whitish fragments. All the cloudy pain and misery that oppressed me rushed together and took the shape of hunger. I eyed those bowls wolfishly, and though it returned to me in dreams, at that time it seemed a small matter that at the end of the arms that lowered one towards me were not hands, but a sort of flap and thumb, like the end of an elephant's trunk. The stuff in the bowl was loose in texture, and whitish-brown in color, rather like lumps of some cold souffle, and it smelt faintly like mushrooms. From a partially divided carcass of a mooncalf that we presently saw, I am inclined to believe it must have been mooncalf flesh. My hands were so tightly chained that I could barely contrive to reach the bowl, but when they saw the effort I made, two of them dexterously released one of the turns about my wrist. Their tentacle hands were soft and cold to my skin. I immediately seized a mouthful of the food. It had the same laxness and texture that all organic structures seem to have upon the moon. It tasted rather like a gaufre or a damp meringue, but in no way was it disagreeable. I took two other mouthfuls. "I wanted food," said I, tearing off a still larger piece. For a time we ate with an utter absence of self-consciousness. We ate and presently drank like tramps in a soup kitchen. Never before nor since have I been hungry to the ravenous pitch, and save that I have had this very experience, I could never have believed that, 250,000 miles out of our proper world, in utter perplexity of soul, surrounded, watched, touched by beings more grotesque and inhuman than the worst creations of a nightmare, it would be possible for me to eat in utter forgetfulness of all these things. They stood about us watching us, and ever and again making a slight elusive twittering that stood to suppose in the stead of speech. I did not even shiver at their touch, and when the first zeal of my feeding was over, I could note that Cavor, too, had been eating with the same shameless abandon. Chapter 14. Experiments in Intercourse. When at last we had made an end of eating, the Selenites linked our hands closely together again, and then untwisted the chains about our feet and rebound them, so as to give us a limited freedom of movement. Then they unfastened the chains about our waists. To do all this they had to handle us freely, and ever and again one of their queer heads came down close to my face, or a soft tentacle hand touched my head or neck. I don't remember that I was afraid then or repelled by their proximity. I think that our incurable anthropomorphism made us imagine they were human heads inside their masks. The skin, like everything else, looked bluish, but that was on account of the light, and it was hard and shiny, quite in the beetle wing fashion, not soft or moist or hairy, as the vertebrated animals would be. Along the crest of the head was a low ridge of whitish spines running from back to front, and a much larger ridge curved on either side over the eyes. The Selenite who untied me used his mouth to help his hands. "They seem to be releasing us," said Cavor. "Remember, we are on the moon. Make no sudden movements." "Are you going to try that geometry?" "If I get a chance, but of course they may make an advance first." We remained passive, and the Selenites, having finished their arrangements, stood back from us and seemed to be looking at us. I say seemed to be, because as their eyes were at the side and not in front, one had the same difficulty in determining the direction in which they were looking as one has in the case of a hen or a fish. They conversed with one another in their reedy tones that seemed to me impossible to imitate or define. The door behind us opened wider, and, glancing over my shoulder, I saw a vague large space beyond, in which quite a little crowd of Selenites were standing. They seemed a curiously miscellaneous rabble. "Do they want us to imitate those sounds?" I asked Cavor. "I don't think so," he said. "It seems to me that they are trying to make us understand something." "I can't make anything of their gestures. Do you notice this one, who is worrying with his head like a man with an uncomfortable collar?" "Let us shake our heads at him." We did that, and finding it ineffectual, attempted an imitation of the Selenites' movements. That seemed to interest them. At any rate, they all set up the same movement. But as that seemed to lead to nothing, we desisted at last, and so did they, and fell into a piping argument among themselves. Then one of them, shorter and very much thicker than the others, and with a particularly wide mouth, squatted down suddenly beside Cavor, and put his hands and feet in the same posture as Cavor's were bound, and then by a dexterous movement stood up. "Cavor!" I shouted. "They want us to get up!" He stared open-mouthed. "That's it," he said. And with much heaving and grunting, because our hands were tied together, we contrived to struggle to our feet. The Selenites made way for our elephantine heavings, and seemed to twitter more volubly. As soon as we were on our feet, the thick-set Selenite came and patted each of our faces with his tentacles, and walked towards the open doorway. That also was plain enough, and we followed him. We saw that 4 of the Selenites standing in the doorway were much taller than the others, and clothed in the same manner as those we had seen in the crater, namely, with spiked round helmets and cylindrical body cases, and that each of the 4 carried a goad with spike and guard made of that same dull-looking metal as the bowls. These 4 closed about us, one on either side of each of us, as we emerged from our chamber into the cavern from which the light had come. We did not get our impression of that cavern all at once. Our attention was taken up by the movements and attitudes of the Selenites immediately about us, and by the necessity of controlling our motion, lest we should startle and alarm them, and ourselves, by some excessive stride. In front of us was the short, thick-set being who had solved the problem of asking us to get up, moving with gestures that seemed, almost all of them, intelligible to us, inviting us to follow him. His spout-like face turned from one of us to the other with a quickness that was clearly interrogative. For a time, I say, we were taken up with these things. But at last the great place that formed a background to our movements asserted itself. It became apparent that the source of such, at least, of the tumult of sounds which had filled our ears ever since we had recovered from the stupefaction of the fungus, was a vast mass of machinery in active movement, whose flying and whirling parts were visible indistinctly over the heads and between the bodies of the Selenites who walked about us. And not only did the web of sounds that filled the air proceed from this mechanism, but also the peculiar blue light that irradiated the whole place. We had taken it as a natural thing that a subterranean cavern should be artificially lit, and even now, though the fact was patent to my eyes, I did not really grasp its import until presently the darkness came. The meaning and structure of this huge apparatus we saw I cannot explain, because we neither of us learnt what it was for, or how it worked. One after another, big shafts of metal flung out and up from its center, their heads traveling in what seemed to me to be a parabolic path. Each dropped a sort of dangling arm as it rose towards the apex of its flight, and plunged down into a vertical cylinder, forcing this down before it. About it moved the shapes of tenders, little figures that seemed vaguely different from the beings about us. As each of the 3 dangling arms of the machine plunged down, there was a clank and then a roaring, and out of the top of the vertical cylinder came pouring this incandescent substance that lit the place. and ran over as milk runs over a boiling pot, and dripped luminously into a tank of light below. It was a cold blue light, a sort of phosphorescent glow, but infinitely brighter, and from the tanks into which it fell it ran in conduits athwart the cavern. Thud, 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 thud came the sweeping arms of this unintelligible apparatus, and the light substance hissed and poured. At first the thing seemed only reasonably large and near to us, and then I saw how exceedingly little the Selenites upon it seemed, and I realized the full immensity of cavern and machine. I looked from this tremendous affair to the faces of the Selenites with a new respect. I stopped, and Cavor stopped, and stared at this thunderous engine. "But this is stupendous," I said. "What can it be for?" Cavor's blue-lit face was full of an intelligent respect. "I can't dream. Surely these beings... Men could not make a thing like that. Look at those arms. Are they on connecting rods?" The thick-set Selenite had gone some paces unheeded. He came back and stood between us and the great machine. I avoided seeing him because I had guessed somehow that his idea was to beckon us onward. He walked away in the direction he wished us to go, and turned and came back, and flicked our faces to attract our attention. Cavor and I looked at one another. "Cannot we show him we are interested in the machine?" I said. "Yes," said Cavor. "We'll try that." He turned to our guide and smiled, and pointed to the machine, and pointed again, and then to his head, and then to the machine. By some defect of reasoning, he seemed to imagine that broken English might help these gestures. "Me look 'em," he said. "Me think 'em very much. Yes." His behavior seemed to check the Selenites in their desire for our progress for a moment. They faced one another, their queer heads moved, the twittering voices came thick and liquid. Then one of them, a lean, tall creature, with a sort of mantle added to the puttee in which the others were dressed, twisted his elephant trunk of a hand about Cavor's waist and pulled him gently to follow our guide, who again went on ahead. Cavor resisted. "We may just as well begin explaining ourselves now. They may think we are new animals, a new sort of mooncalf, perhaps. It is most important that we should show an intelligent interest from the outset." He began to shake his head violently. "No, no," he said. "Me not come on 1 minute. Me look at 'em." "Isn't there some geometrical point you might bring in apropos of that affair?" I suggested as the Selenites conferred again. "Possibly a parabolic," he began. He yelled loudly and leaped 6 feet or more. One of the 4 armed moon men had pricked him with a goad. I turned on the goad-bearer behind me with a swift, threatening gesture, and he started back. This and Cavor's sudden shouting leap clearly astonished all the Selenites. They receded hastily, facing us. For one of those moments that seemed to last forever, we stood in angry protest, with a scattered semicircle of these inhuman beings about us. "He pricked me," said Cavor with a catching of the voice. "I saw him," I answered. "Confound it," I said to the Selenites. "We're not going to stand that. What on earth do you take us for?" I glanced quickly right and left. Far away across the blue wilderness of cavern I saw a number of other Selenites running towards us. Broad and slender they were, and one with a larger head than the others. The cavern spread wide and low, and receded in every direction into darkness. Its roof, I remember, seemed to bulge down, as if with the weight of the vast thickness of rocks that prisoned us. There was no way out of it, no way out of it. Above, below, in every direction was the unknown, and these inhuman creatures, with goads and gestures, confronting us, and we 2 unsupported men. End of chapter.